So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I am excited to start our program this afternoon, featuring three-time alumnus, author, and UIC faculty member, Dr. Gary Buslick. Regardless if you are an expert or barely remember reading Romeo and Juliet in high school, this fun program will have you questioning what you know about Shakespeare as Dr. Buslick takes us through this entertaining discussion. Did Shakespeare really write those plays? Thank you so much, Dr. Buslick, for being with us today, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, I appreciate being here. It's an honor. And I'll tell you what, go to the next slide, slide number 2, and then you'll see me. Yeah, that's me. That's one of my rare pictures of me smiling. That was probably the last class of the semester, I'm guessing. I'm Gary Buslick. I am a proud UIC alumnus, and I also currently teach Shakespeare here at UIC for our terrific English department. Made even more terrific because I happen to teach Shakespeare here. Anyhow, I thought you guys might like this presentation because with the pandemic lockdown, we're all tired of 2.5 Men reruns and talking baby talk to our cats, and we're bored to freaking death. Next slide, please. That's my cat. Here's what I want to talk about today. Go back to a slide. Well, you can keep it there. That's fine. Whenever I meet someone new and I tell them I teach Shakespeare, inevitably they ask me who really wrote those plays. And frankly, I'm sick of it. So today I'm going to talk about what we call the Shakespeare authorship question, or AntiStratforian Theory. In simple terms, was it really the guy from Stratford who was what many consider to be the greatest writer who ever lived? Or was it someone else who bought Shakespeare's name in order to conceal his or her identity? Stay on that slide, don't move it yet. So now we're going to have some fun. I'll explain how the anti-Stratfordian controversy got its start, the basis of its concept, and its most celebrated proponents. I'll tell you who the doubters believe might be the real Shakespeare, and then I'll one by one rip those anti-Stratforian arguments to pitiful shreds and host a GoFundMe page to raise money to erect a statue of myself in front of Al's Beef on Taylor Street. As a bonus, I'll then tell you how Shakespeare helped us win World War II. It's true. So stay with me. In return, when we get to the question and answer segment, you're not allowed to ask me any questions to which I don't know the answers. And if I don't, I'm just going to make something up. So it's at your own risk. Next slide, please, number 5. Based on the anti-Stratfordians' conspiratorial arguments, you'll have to decide for yourselves whether or not William Shakespeare of Stratford was the real literary genius. I won't try to influence you one way or the other. Just remember that America never really landed on the moon, and Paul McCartney died just before the Abbey Road album, and Elvis is still alive eating banana and peanut butter sandwiches in the basement of the MGM Hotel in Las Vegas. The anti-Stratfordian theory got into driving gear in the mid-1800s when an American crazy lady named Delia Bacon decided that Shakespeare's contemporary, the intellect, scholar, scientist, writer, Sir Francis Bacon of England, was the real author of the Bard masterpieces. Let me get this out of the way right now. Delia spent her last years in a mental institution. This is Delia here, that's her picture. Presumably before they locked her up. Because of their same last names, Delia Bacon got it into her head that Francis Bacon was her forebearer, which he was not. They were no relation at all. And she spent years trying to prove that Sir Francis Bacon was the real Shakespeare, and that he used the actor Shakespeare's name as a front. And indeed, an actor Shakespeare did have minor roles in several of the plays and was listed as such on the playbills, or what we now call the playbills. Delia went on to write a voluminous, incomprehensible book laying out her so-called proof, 700 pages of prose so turgid it verges on the hysterical in more ways than one. Her arguments made no sense, but the concept was apparently intriguing enough to inspire ongoing doubts about Shakespeare's real identity, doubts that weirdly linger to this day, as does apparently Elvis. That's him. Delia's insanity and her wacky so-called evidence aside, the anti-Stratfordian concept began to take root, so that by the end of the 19th century, such luminaries as Mark Twain, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Sigmund Freud, Walt Whitman, Henry James, and others were buying into the notion that the great writer must have been someone other than the man from Stratford. Next picture, please, number 8. That's my man Sigmund. We're like this. In the 20th century, the actors Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, Derek Jacobi, and Robin Williams bought into the anti-Stratfordian nonsense, as did the writers Helen Keller, Daphne du Maurier, and Anne Rice. There are lots of less famous doubters too, entertainers, scholars, suburban mahjong ladies. Next slide, please, number 9. That's your mahjong tiles. They're selling a lot of those these days. In any event, there have now been thousands of books, dissertations, articles, and TV shows suggesting, or more often insisting, that the plays were written by someone other than the man from Stratford. The controversy having been respectful airings on PBS, in the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, and even Scientific American, among others. My own not-so-luminary younger brother, Mark, a criminal justice professor here at UIC, also was dumb enough to believe that the great writer must have been someone other than the man from Stratford. Until that is, I gave him a crisp $5 bill, whereupon he immediately changed his mind. When we were kids, I convinced him that our parents named him Mark because that's the Hebrew word for totally stupid. Next slide, please. That's my brother, Mark. He's a retired Chicago police commander. So you connect the dots. $5 bill, Chicago, police, connect the dots. Back to my Shakespeare. The basic premise of the anti-Stratfordian theory is an elitist one. The plays so brim with expertise in law, medicine, statesmanship, history, court life, military affairs, seafaring, politics, music, classical arts and literature, life abroad, and every other blimey thing, that they can't possibly be the work of a single lightly educated provincial. That's the anti-Stratfordian theory, anyway, their elitist theory. How could some country bumpkin, meaning Stratford upon Avon, with no more than a grammar school education possibly have written so many brilliant works rife with so much expansive knowledge, let alone have the boundless artistic talent to have produced one masterpiece after another? That's their theory. Next slide, please. The elitist theory. Their assumption is that William Shakespeare of the Warwickshire countryside, meaning Stratford, was at best an amiable stooge, an actor who sold his name as cover for someone of much greater talent and social standing, who couldn't, for fear of being publicly shamed, be identified as a playwright, acting and stage writing then being considered sordid enterprises. Obviously, so the anti-Stratfordians claim, the plays and poems must have been written by a highly educated aristocrat who darn well intended to keep his upper crust reputation intact. Better yet, some anti-Stratfordians argue, written not by one, but a cadre of learned elites. There are two main propositions of the anti-Stratfordian theory. One, with absolute certainty, the man from Stratford, for indeed there was a William Shakespeare from Stratford, was not the genius bard we know and love. And two, instead, it must have been so-and-so, one or more of the alternative candidates. And here they say is our proof. So altogether, more than 50 candidates, including Queen Elizabeth I, have been suggested as the real writer or writers of the poems and plays. The truth is, all of their so-called evidence is pretty flimsy, despite the credentials of their proponents. I'll give you a recent example. Recently, Radio Tehran announced that Shakespeare was really a 16th century Arab sheikh named Zubair bin William. And through some strange linguistic alchemy, sheikh became translated to sheikh, hence Sheikh Zubair William. That's how goofy it is. Today, though, I'm going to focus on just three of the alternative Shakespeares most favored by the anti-Stratfordians. Their most likely candidates include Shakespeare's writer contemporaries Christopher Marlowe, Kit Marlowe, Sir Francis Bacon, and Edward deVere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Next slide, please, number 12. First, I'll cite the arguments that proponents make for their specific candidates, followed by the reasons why they're seriously flawed, and finally, why the doubters' general claims are also full of you-know-what. Next slide, please. Number 13, thank you. That's Francis Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon. As I mentioned before, thanks to his 19th century namesake, no relation though, Delia Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon was the earliest known candidate as the real author of the alleged real author of the famous poems and plays. Bacon was a respected author, scientist, philosopher, statesman, parliamentarian, and intellect who served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England. He served as Queen Elizabeth's legal advisor and was later knighted by King James, so he wasn't a nobody. Now, according to the anti-Stratfordians, although Bacon was an accomplished essay writer and thinker, because of his high status, he couldn't possibly debase himself as a common playwright, someone who pandered to the lusty impulses of the rowdy London playgoers. Yet they say, because of his irrepressible genius, neither could he contain his need to write the finest poems and dramas ever seen and heard. Because he was financially set, he had no problem paying off the impoverished and eternally grateful actor Shakespeare to pretend to be the masterpiece's author, so they claim. Because Sir Francis, who was a scientist, remember, had invented the first cipher system called the bilateral substitution code, it also seems logical to the Baconites that he would cunningly confess his authorship to posterity by slipping secret messages into the poems and plays that he had penned under his Shakespeare pseudonym. Next slide, please, number 14. That's the Francis Bacon bilateral cipher code. In Ouija board fashion, using tortuous systems involving prime numbers, logarithms, square roots, capital and lowercase letters, and other arcane and self-serving devices to guide them, devout Baconites got to work finding hidden messages in the Shakespeare texts. Tormented by an obsession not unlike the belief that if you play a Beatles album backwards, you'll discover messages about Paul's death, Baconites would vet Shakespeare passages backwards, upside down and diagonally, inventing elaborate acrostics, skipping every 5 letters or every third word, shifting here and there as they saw fit to prove, so-called prove, that Sir Francis was speaking to them, speaking to us from the grave. Next slide, please. That's a Ouija board. They're selling a lot of those these days too, along with mahjong tiles. At least until the early 1900s, Francis Bacon had reached a cult-like status as the actual author of not only the Shakespeare plays, but those of other writers of the time and the King James Version of the Bible and most of the literary output of the Renaissance. That's a cult. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to cite some arguments against Francis Bacon being the real Shakespeare. Along with the question of why a super-subtle mind like Bacon's would have resorted to the juvenile device of incorporating hidden cipher messages in his plays, the obvious argument against Bacon as a Shakespeare candidate is, given his other voluminous duties and work, how the heck would he find the time to write at least 37 popular plays and over 150 glorious poems? What's more, Bacon was known to have an extreme dislike of the theater, and he attacked it as a frivolous pastime. He did not attend plays or express any interest in writing for the stage, and there is an inconvenient lack of connection between Sir Francis and anyone connected with the theater. His outward disdain might have been clever fakery, of course, but then where and how would he have learned playwriting techniques, and how would he have devoted an entire secret lifetime to mastering them? Among the Baconites proving that Sir Francis embedded secret messages into the text to prove his authorship, there were no two deciphering methods alike. Each Baconian developed his or her own arbitrary decoding system, conveniently manipulated to achieve the desired outcome. In the same way, any of us could take an IHOP menu, for example, and using our own decoding system, find the hidden message, "I am Denny." Next slide, please. That's Christopher Kit Marlowe. So here's arguments for Kit Marlowe. First of all, he was Shakespeare's good friend, and he was a brilliant young poet and playwright, and he was considered by many to be the Bard's greatest script-writing competitor. Next slide, please. Being the same age as Shakespeare, they were only 2 months apart, and having the requisite playwriting talent, and being a university-educated playwright, and running in the same acting social circles as his pal William, Marlowe is thought to be another likely candidate as the real author of the Bard's masterpieces, one of the leading candidates. Because Marlowe, a notorious anti-authority troublemaker, had to constantly lie low from the law, he certainly had ample writing time, or he would have at any rate had he not been murdered at the age of 29, well before the appearance of most of Shakespeare's plays. The AntiStratforians who advocate for Marlowe being the true author of Shakespeare's plays theorize that Christopher Kit, knowing that a warrant was out for his arrest, cunningly faked his own death and escaped to Italy, where he spent the rest of his life writing what we now know as Shakespeare's Italian plays, among others. Because they were friends, Shakespeare was willing to protect Marlowe by maintaining the charade, so they claim. Next slide, please. That's Italy. The AntiStratforians reinforce their argument by reminding us that as far as we know, in real life, Shakespeare had never actually been to Italy. They ask, why would someone risk so much of his reputation and his creative power by writing about a place to which he had never been? Next slide, please, number 20. So now I'm going to refute those arguments. In the first place, the evidence for Marlowe being murdered is virtually incontestable. Besides the killer, there was at least one witness to the crime. The killer was arrested and tried, although later he was found to have acted self-defense, admittedly. Marlowe, though, was properly buried. Now, if, as some historians believe, the assassin had been paid a bounty by the crown To kill the avowed atheist and possible spy Marlowe, the killer and witness then would have risked their own lives by faking the murder and joining the writer's conspiracy. See, in those days, if you double-crossed the authorities, they didn't let you off with a slap on the wrist. More likely, you could kiss your wrist goodbye. The point is, there's not a shred of real evidence that Marlowe did indeed hole up in Italy or anywhere else except maybe the ground after his allegedly fake death. No legal records, secondhand hearsay, anecdotal evidence, nothing. As for Shakespeare never having been to Italy, we can't know that at all. For the 7 years between the time he left Stratford and when he showed up in London, we have absolutely no idea where he went or what he did. We call those the lost years, and we call them the lost years for a good reason. What's more, at least 2 of Shakespeare's Italian plays were likely written before Marlowe allegedly snuck away to Italy, found a cushy writing chair, penned the plays, and sent them back to London, with, I assume, instructions to the horse to keep his mouth shut. And even if Shakespeare had never actually spent time in Italy, remember that official censorship sometimes led to severe consequences for writers. Setting plays with controversial subjects or themes in a foreign country like Italy provided the London-based Shakespeare the safety he needed to express himself regarding risky matters. Besides, London playgoers were fascinated by the life and times of Renaissance Italians. As long as the public kept slipping coins into the Globe's drop box, Shakespeare was determined to give them what they craved. Next slide, please. Number 21. That's Edward deVere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Now, to many eyes, the most convincing anti-Stratfordian candidate is indeed Edward deVere. His candidacy as the real Shakespeare first took hold in 1918 when an English schoolmaster named, are you ready for this? J. Thomas Looney, you can't make this up, in his book Shakespeare Identified, proved to his own satisfaction, if no one else's, that no one but deVere could have been the bard. Next slide, please. Number 22. Okay, so indeed there are, at least on the face of it, a few intriguing, if not quite compelling, arguments for the Earl of Oxford's case. In the first place, unlike Francis Bacon, deVere was a regular playgoer. He was a lover of the stage, a patron of the arts, and himself an unabashed, if not especially talented poet and court playwright. Unlike Stratford's Shakespeare, deVere was university educated. He was clever, well-traveled, and moved in the kind of courtly circles that were the settings of much of Shakespeare's works. One of deVere's daughters was engaged to the Earl of Southampton, who was the dedicatee of Shakespeare's 2 narrative poems, coincidentally. Next slide, please. Number 23. More arguments for deVere. His nobleman's coat of arms depicts a lion shaking a broken spear. deVere did, in fact, spend a lot of time in Italy, the locale of many Shakespeare's plays, as I said. He inherited the title Lord Great Chamberlain of England, suggesting that he named Shakespeare's acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, after himself. And finally, for now, deVere's father died when he was 12, and his mother quickly remarried, suggesting a principal theme of Hamlet, the play Hamlet. Next slide, please. Number 24. That's good, right there. Now, while the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward deVere, is a current leading candidate as the real Shakespeare, in many respects, his candidacy is the easiest to demolish, which I will now do. For starters, deVere was known to be an arrogant, petulant, financially irresponsible, and widely disliked person. At the age of 17, for example, he murdered a household servant in a fit of anger. There's nothing in his behavior at any point in his life indicating the least gift for compassion, empathy, understanding of human emotions and spirit, let alone the talent that permeates Shakespeare's works. Nor was there any indication in deVere's character that it demonstrated the kind of commitment to hard work that would have allowed him to write 36 plays anonymously, in addition to the much inferior work under his own name, while remaining actively in court. And speaking of inferior work, if you place any of deVere's sonnets next to any of Shakespeare's sonnets, most high school students will be able to quickly point out who wrote which. There's no comparison. If a main anti-Stratfordian premise is that the real author used a pseudonym because playwriting was considered low class, why did Oxford not shy away from using his own name to write his own poems and plays? Why would a man of boundless vanity like Oxford seek to hide his identity in the great plays and poetry, but not his own mediocre ones? What's more, deVere was patron of his own acting company, the Earl of Oxford's Men. Why would he write his best work for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a competing troupe? You see? Next slide, please, 25. Good, right there. I saved the best for last. Are you ready? At least 10 of Shakespeare's plays are known to have been written after the year 1604. 1604. We know that because they make references to or were influenced by actual events that happened after 1604. Why is that significant? Because Edward deVere, 17th Earl of Oxford, definitely, without a doubt, absolutely, once and for all, incontestably croaked in 1604. Croaked as in died, dead. No pulse, no eye twitch, no toe wiggle, dead, as in D-E-A-D. So for most folks with what we call brains, this undisputed fact would be enough to close the lid on this particular anti-Stratfordian coffin. But no, not those diehards. What the anti-Stratfordians believe, if you're ready for this, is that deVere left his stack of masterpieces with instructions that they be released under William Shakespeare's name in measured intervals, 1 or 2 a year, after deVere's demise. Naturally, the Earl being so brilliantly prescient, his stack of plays would conveniently run out just before the real Shakespeare kicked the bucket. As for the play's references to actual events that deVere never lived to see, his anti-Stratfordian acolytes insist that those events were later added to the plays by others to maintain the Earl's secrecy. Okay, well, this preposterous theory hardly deserves a rebuttal, yet to this day, the 17th Earl of Oxford remains the leading contender as the real author of Shakespeare's work. So if that doesn't illustrate how pitiful the whole anti-Stratfordian concept is, I don't know what would. Next slide, please. Queen Elizabeth, we're like this too. Me and Freud and Liz. Arguments for other anti-Stratfordian possibilities still do hang in the air like garlic breath, speaking of Queen Elizabeth. They say the Queen must have been the real Shakespeare because the greatest characters in the plays are women. I can't dispute that. Or they say the writing is too brilliant to be the work of any single author, and so had to have been the efforts of a syndicate of exemplary talents. Can you imagine the extent of that conspiratorial silence? And on and on and on they go. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly go through the general, now that I've refuted the 3 principal anti-Stratfordian candidates. I'm going to go through a generic list of their arguments and then immediately refute everyone. But these are common arguments we hear all the time. So in addition to arguing for specific candidates, the anti-Stratfordians cite many generic reasons why the man from Stratford could not have been the author of the plays and poems. For example, they say that Shakespeare's upbringing was unsatisfactory for such brilliant authorship. A glove maker's son, they say, must surely have lacked the breeding, education, and background to have penned the most sophisticated poetics and dramas the world has ever known. Answer: William's upbringing was not backward or in any way conspicuously deprived at all. His father, yes, was a glove maker and merchant, but he was a prominent citizen. He was the high bailiff, which is the equivalent of mayor of Stratford, an important market town, and not incidentally a frequent stopping point for traveling acting companies. Stratford was not some backwater. Yes, 3 days horseback ride from London, but they were an important market town. William attended grammar school 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in addition to Sunday school. His grammar school was regarded as one of the finest in England. They studied Latin, Greek, poetry, prose, and the classics. I hate to say it, but in many respects, their elementary school education was frankly better than that of our universities. No offense. And in fact, Shakespeare borrowed many of his plots and characters, story ideas, from essential grammar school textbooks of the time. So no, Stratford was not some sleepy backwater town, and Shakespeare didn't arrive in London as an uncultured bumpkin. It's true he was not an aristocrat, but look, since when is it unique achievement for someone brought up modestly to excel later in life? And of course, there is such a thing as genius. Shakespeare's famous writing peer, Ben Jonson, never attended university either, but no one ever suggests that Jonson was a fraud. Another thing the AntiStratforians cite. Okay, they say, but then how could a country boy, even with a decent grammar school education, possibly have incorporated in his work so much knowledge and expertise of so many different fields, such as court life, military, medicine, and so on? Answer: today, novelists insert all sorts of research details for realism's sake, don't they? Besides, and this is important, Shakespeare's works are far more rife with rustic allusions than those of his London contemporaries. We see in his works allusions, expert allusions to farm animals, preparation and uses of hides. Remember, his father was a glove maker. Plants, pastoral customs throughout his works. All of which is why his London rival, Robert Greene, mocked him for his constant use of provincialisms. What's more, careful analysis, and we do that, of Shakespeare's language reveals a dialect much more Warwickshire countryside than big city London. The fact is, none of the AntiStratforian candidates wrote in a voice remotely like Shakespeare's. Okay, they say, the AntiStratforians say, but we know very little about Shakespeare's private life, they claim, and what we do know is clouded with mysteries and contradictions. Answer: that's a common misconception, another common misconception about Shakespeare. We know as much about his personal life as we do about most non-aristocrats of his time. We know more about his life in Stratford than we do about any other Stratfordian. And in London, we know where he lived, where he hung out, and with whom. As far as for those 7 lost years between Stratford and London, look, why would we expect a record of any struggling, not yet famous young man? Elizabethans did not keep records as we do today, and they were constantly plagued with fires. The Globe Theatre, for example, burned to the ground in 1613, probably taking Shakespeare's scripts with it. The infamous London fire of 1666 destroyed most of the city and probably many archived personal letters and documents. Okay, so another one of their arguments. The name on Shakespeare's birth certificate and other references during his life are of various spellings of his name, suggesting different people. Answer: in Shakespeare's day, English spelling was not standardized as it is now. So it wasn't unusual even for proper names to be spelled variously, even by their possessors. In short, uniform spelling was not important. We take that for granted now, but they didn't care. And the AntiStratforians then claim that Shakespeare's known signatures, there's just a few of them, are the laborious scrawlings of a borderline illiterate. Answer: again, not at all. They're just examples of what we call, and they call, the secretary script of the times. Very elaborate script that we can't relate to now. Very difficult for us to read. They appear shaky on his will because it's reasonable to assume he might have been sick when he signed the will, possibly near death. Next slide, please. Number 28. There's my man. Billy. Another argument by the AntiStratforians. They claim there are no documented references that the man from Stratford was an author. Answer: that's not even close to being true. Shakespeare is named, for example, he's named 7 times as the author of plays performed before King James. And it was the Stratford Shakespeare who was invited then to march in the king's coronation procession. The man from Stratford is named as a writer by his rival, Robert Greene, and others. And in his eulogy, in Shakespeare's eulogy, his fellow writer and friend Ben Jonson refers to Shakespeare as, quote, the sweet swan of Avon, meaning Stratford upon Avon. Look, the only absence of records are not documents connecting Shakespeare to his works, but of connecting any other human being to them. The AntiStratforians then say, there's no reference in Shakespeare's will or otherwise that he owned any play scripts or even any books in his will. The answer is that legally, he didn't own any play scripts. They belonged to his acting company. So he couldn't have bequeathed them to anybody. Regarding his books, this can't be refuted because we know nothing about his incidental possessions. Might as well say he never owned a pair of pants. As far as we know, then, he spent his life naked from the waist down. Sort of like a 16th century Zoom session. Items like clothing and furniture, books, and so on were seldom specified in wills. However, in his will, he did happen to leave friendship rings to several of his London acting company playwrights. Company playwrights and actors. And they claim, the AntiStratforians claim, that unlike less famous contemporaries, there were no portraits of Shakespeare painted in his lifetime. Answer: that's not proof of anything. He might have been too modest. A portrait might have been destroyed in a fire. There might still be a painting out there somewhere. In fact, just a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a 16th century portrait thought to be a young Shakespeare was discovered on an English estate. We don't know for a fact, it hasn't been proven, but we know it was 16th century, and there's reasonable reason to believe that it might have been Shakespeare. Next slide, please, number 29. The AntiStratforians claim that Shakespeare never took, they point out, I should say, that he never took legal action, as far as we know, against pirated editions of his work. What was he afraid of? They want to know. Okay, answer. Again, in the first place, his acting company, not Shakespeare himself, owned his plays, so he couldn't take legal action if he had wanted to. Secondly, they didn't have stringent copyright laws like we have today. What we call plagiarism was a common and mostly unpenalized practice. Next slide, please. Anti-Stratfordians claim that Shakespeare's death entry in his parish registry doesn't mention him as an actor or dramatist. Answer: the monument bust, this is a picture here of the monument bust of Shakespeare near his grave, installed shortly after his death, depicts him with quill and paper in hand, making it clear he was a writer of commanding stature, as does the monument's inscription, clearly. And finally, for now, for our presentation, they claim, the Anti-Stratforians claim that while the death of Shakespeare's famous acting colleague in the same acting company, Richard Burbage, who played the leading role in many of Shakespeare's plays, when he died, it was met with a great outpouring of grief in London, whereas Shakespeare's death passed virtually unacknowledged. Answer: well, how many of us know who writes our favorite TV shows? How many of those writers are featured on Entertainment Tonight or are MCs for the Academy Awards? The fact is, we know and publicly celebrate the actors, not the writers. Besides, Richard Burbage was living and acting in London just before his death, at the time of his death. Well, Shakespeare had been retired for 4 years and living quietly out in the countryside. As far as we could tell, William was a modest, even a shy man. During his writing days, while some of his contemporaries were out carousing, getting into trouble with the law, sometimes getting themselves stabbed to death, the bard was hunkered down under candlelight, sleeves rolled up, quietly penning the greatest literature the world has ever known. Next slide, please. In conclusion, all of the anti-Stratfordian sentiment, every ounce of it, involves manipulative investigations, sweeping generalities, wispy conjectures, faulty arguments, or gross misstatements of facts. No one has ever produced a particle of hard evidence to endow the alternative claimants with the necessary time, talent, and motive for anonymity to write the plays of William Shakespeare, to create in their spare time the greatest literature ever produced in English, in a voice patently not their own, in a manner so cunning that they fooled virtually everyone during their own lifetimes and for hundreds of years afterward. If there had been a cover-up of the bard's real identity, the conspiracy of silence would have been laughably improbable. A confederacy of secrecy not only among theater people and Shakespeare's friends and family, but among their second and third-hand acquaintances and everyone's descendants. Shakespeare is the only writer of notoriety whose authorship has been called into question, let alone so relentlessly, furiously, and often vindictively, all without a bit of real evidence that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. Next slide, please. I promised you that at the end, I would tell you how Shakespeare helped us win World War II. It wasn't enough that he was the greatest writer who ever lived. He did help us win World War II, and here's how. There was a guy by the name of George Fabian, very wealthy guy, an early 20th century Illinois, by the way, coincidentally, textile tycoon, who was obsessed with the notion, thanks Delia Bacon, that the country yokel from Stratford was not the real author of the greatest literature ever written. At Riverbank, his 300-acre estate in Geneva, Illinois, Fabian created a private scientific laboratory, hiring experts to research such things as acoustic reverberations, the effects of the moon on crop growth, and, yes, secret coded messages in Shakespeare's plays, proving that the supposed Stratford genius was a fraud. Fabian's anti-Stratfordian obsession, and that's what it was, kick-started the field of war cryptology. U.S. Army officers then came to Riverbank to learn how to decipher secret messages sent by spies in foreign countries. A couple by the name of Elizabeth and William Friedman, who had begun their cryptology careers working on those Shakespeare manuscripts at Riverbank at Fabian's invitation, ended up in World War I and II, decoding enemy communications for the United States military, and during World War II were instrumental in breaking German and Japanese secret codes, the Friedmans. And in doing so, they secured our crucial victories at the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway and others. Here's the point. They later ultimately debunked the anti-Stratfordian hidden messages rubbish. Remember, they worked on it for Fabian at his request. They came out and explicitly and publicly stated there were no secret hidden messages in any of the Shakespeare texts. Next slide, please. Okay, and thank you, UIC, for my many happy years of happy affiliation with our English department and our terrific alumni association. I especially want to thank my English department head, Lisa Freeman, and I must say our terrific UIC provost, Susan Poser. Very hardworking people, as are the UIC Alumni Association ladies, very hardest working people I know. So now I'll be happy to take any questions about Shakespeare or my brother or my cat.
Well, thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for talking us through this. We did have a couple of questions that came in beforehand, but we encourage folks to put things in the chat, and I will defer if you would like to ask questions about your brother or not. So first question was there a financial incentive to discredit the author after his death, or was it just for fun?
A financial incentive. Say that again, Karen.
So was there a financial incentive to discredit Shakespeare? Or why were people really doing it? Why were they coming up with these theories?
Well, that's a great question. There could not have been among the notorious anti-Stratfordians like Freud and some of the actors in the 20th century and 21st century actors. No, there obviously wouldn't have been a financial incentive. Why? I think it was an elitist kind of thing, or maybe they were jumping on the bandwagon. For people like Delia Bacon or J. Thomas Looney and others, yeah, there was a financial incentive because they wrote books, and presumably they sold the books. And I don't know if that was the primary incentive, but sure, it makes sense that there was some financial incentive. People write books today to sell, and some of them are goofy. I've written a couple myself.
Your books are wonderful. Thank you. So you touched upon this just briefly when you were talking about the bust that was made for him after he passed away. But the question is, were these plays known for their cultural achievement in their own time, or did the hundreds of years between their writing and the present reveal their true value?
Another good question. Shakespeare was famous in his lifetime. Queen Elizabeth loved him. He and his acting company played at court for Queen Elizabeth and later for King James. As I said in my presentation, Shakespeare was invited by King James in 1603 to march in his inauguration procession. He was very famous in his lifetime. He was very wealthy. Actors never made money in his lifetime. The only way Shakespeare made money was as and even scriptwriters didn't make money. They usually, even Ben Jonson died broke and others. But Shakespeare was not only a brilliant writer, but he was a great businessman. So he was one of the partners in the acting company and the Globe Theater. And that's where he made his fortune. It was a very successful enterprise, the Globe Theater. And then he later bought property in London. Just before he retired after his son died, he bought the second biggest house in Stratford. So he was very wealthy, relatively wealthy, not as wealthy as an aristocrat, but he was, for non-aristocrat, he was very wealthy, and he made his money as owner of the Globe and owner of the part owner of the acting company. But to answer the question, yes, he was a very famous. The plays, the Globe was filled up every time. He was extremely famous in his time, and he stayed out of trouble, unlike some of the other, like Marlowe, for example, who was assassinated because of his, he crossed the boundaries of censorship, and he insulted too many people of authority, and the thought is that the authorities had him killed. But Shakespeare managed to stay out of trouble. One way, as I said, pointed out, was he set some of his plays not in England. In fact, very few of his plays, except for the history plays, were set in England. They were usually set in England or other places, like Cyprus or Venice. Next, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, absolutely. A question that has come in is, what is your favorite Shakespeare play, if you had to pick one?
Oh, yeah, people ask me that all the time. Oh, well, boy, that's a tough one, because I love The Merchant of Venice. They call that a comedy, but it's really not. It's not a comedy in the way we think of comedies. It's not a comedy meaning that it's funny. It's just a very powerful play. I also like Othello, very powerful play. Among the comedies, I love As You Like It. But there's so many I like. I love The Tempest was his last known play that he wrote while he was in London. So there are a lot. History plays, I love Henry V, very powerful play, and on and on.
If you had to pick one that everybody had to read, because obviously I think the high school curriculum says Romeo and Juliet, and there's a couple that are there, but if you had to say this is absolutely the one you should read.
Well, that's a good question, because in my elementary course, my introductory course to Shakespeare, when I teach that, I have them read Merchant of Venice. I think that's a play, among others, but that, in my mind, is a play whose themes apply to our society 400 some odd years later. We can extrapolate a lot of what goes on in that play to what goes on in our culture today. We could do that. We could do that with many of Shakespeare's works, but The Merchant of Venice, to me, is, if I had to pick one play to ask anyone or suggest anyone to read, it would be The Merchant of Venice. It's a terrific play. And I'll tell you something else. Shakespeare's language, it's not Old English, it's modern English, called early modern English. He never wrote it to be read. It's not easy to read Shakespeare plays, for sure, especially for beginners. But if you see it on stage, it was meant to be heard and seen, not read. So if you see a Shakespeare play, and we have a terrific Shakespeare playhouse in Chicago at Navy Pier Theater, or you see the movie, for example, in I think it's 2004, I think, Al Pacino starred in as Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, great Hollywood production. Terrific, it won all kinds of awards. See the movie, The Merchant of Venice, with Al Pacino and Jeremy Irons. It's terrific, and you won't have to worry about not understanding every word, because you'll get it. So I suggest you see that movie. It's terrific.
Well, thank you. So one last question that has come in for you. Is your brother Mark, was he really adopted?
No, Mark wasn't adopted. He was, this is what I heard. I wasn't there. I heard he was bought for $11.15 from a band of roving gypsies. I don't know if you consider it adopted or not, but that's still. And our parents tried to get their money back, but the gypsies were long gone.
I don't know if you could see he was holding up a sign that just said blah blah blah. So. which we will take as applause, applause, applause. And so, so thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and discussion. I know it's been very eye-opening and just very humorous. So thank you, Dr. Buslick. We really, really appreciate all of your time. Just very quick to close out the program. Please join us next Thursday, November 5th at noon Central Standard Time for our next alumni exchange program featuring UIC political science professor Dick Simpson, who is an election expert and former Chicago alderman, who will break down the election and discuss the impact on our nation as he presents the 2020 election results and the future of Chicago. I think this is one you are not going to want to miss. Thank you again, Dr. Buslick, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again at the Alumni Exchange programming, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Karen. Bye-bye.
Bye.